First panel discussion of the week. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Gemma Rogers, co-founder of FINTRAIL, for Dare to Share versus Need to Know.
Brilliant. Thanks, JP. Really appreciate you having us here today and really looking forward to the rest of the conference. So welcome to this session of FFE Con Week, and thank you very much for joining us. We're going to discuss the highs and lows of data sharing in an anti-financial crime context today. And I'm really delighted to be joined by some wonderful panelists. And I'd love for them to introduce themselves. Obviously, we have John Cusack, who you heard from earlier, but John, maybe I can just pass it to you for a moment just to say hello. Oh, can you come off mute, John? Sorry.
Yeah, there you go. Gemma, lovely to be here. I won't go on further, but looking forward to the discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. And Jonathan Draper from ComplyAdvantage.
Yeah, hi there. I look after product development at ComplyAdvantage. So we're building a risk insights platform to bring the right information at the right time into risk-based decision making, and working with FFE on a data sharing project, which we'll come on to talk about. So delighted to join the panel. Thanks,
Jonathan. And for the avoidance of doubt, John Cusack will be John throughout this, and Jonathan Draper will be Jonathan, just in case some of you are audio only. And then I'm delighted to welcome Mike Moate from Countingup.
Hi, so yeah, Mike Moate, Chief Technology Officer at Countingup, where we make it easier to run your business. We were early FFE members, and indeed I led some of our early fin crime efforts. We have a much larger team here now, and I mainly work to ensure they've got the tools and technology they need in place. I used to attend FFE myself. These days I don't, but I do remain involved with initiatives like the data sharing group, which we're going to talk about.
Brilliant, thanks Mike, it's great to have you. And definitely last but not least, Kristen Alma from Financial Action Task Force, FATF.
Hello, and very happy to be here as well. So I'm Kristen Alma. I'm a policy analyst with the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF Secretariat. And currently I'm leading a new project on looking at new technologies to facilitate information sharing between financial institutions for AML CFT. Thank you.
Brilliant. So as you can see, a great lineup, and thanks so much again to the panel for joining us today. So as we know, financial crime continues to be a global issue affecting millions of lives. We saw that in the Unseen video, and there are countless other examples that we can call on. As the World Economic Forum points out, every year, an estimated $2.4 trillion in proceeds from activities such as forced prostitution, terrorism, and drug trafficking will be laundered through the world's financial markets and banking systems. And only a very small amount of this activity is detected in the global financial system. Those in the industry know, as John pointed out in his opening address, that we need a more connected and coordinated approach to tackling financial crime, particularly when it comes to information sharing. The concept of dare to share instead of need to know in the intelligence world has long been proven and led to specific examples of success in detecting and preventing terror attacks, for example, when intelligence is shared among trusted agencies. A comparable use case in financial services would be to enable financial institutions to halt international networks of money laundering through notifying other financial service providers about businesses or individuals of concern, rather than simply closing one account at one institution, only for the crime to continue undisturbed via another account at another institution, as is currently the case. However, sharing information, particularly when it comes to the sensitive data that financial institutions handle, is challenging, not least because of the concerns about GDPR and tipping off offences, which often make it unpalatable for financial services firms to run the risk of sharing data on their customers about whom they have financial crime concerns. So to kick us off, and as alluded to, ComplyAdvantage, along with the FinTech FinCrime Exchange and FINTRAIL, is currently working on a live data sharing initiative. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Jonathan to give us a bit of an overview on this project.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. So there's a number of different data sharing projects out there. So rather than kind of recreate those or try to redevelop those, we're taking a slightly different approach. So our focus is more less on the technologies and privacy enhancing technologies and things like that, which I know we'll come on to talk about in a bit, but more on developing business processes that can help participants to balance the privacy, the data protection and tipping off rules, while still getting value from sharing information with each other to help fight financial crime. And within that, the particular processes we've decided to focus on are those around KYC, customer screening and ongoing monitoring. So versus some of the others, I know some of the projects are looking more at the transactions and information sharing around those. So I guess those are kind of two slight points of difference with the project we're doing. I'm not a legal expert. We have brought on legal expertise from outside throughout the project. And so we've started really simple with sharing some much less sensitive information about companies and really creating the simplest possible process flow for our participants. So we've focused our time and energy to this point on working with participants and getting that legal expertise to help balance what's valuable for our participants to share and what it's okay for them to share from data privacy and tipping off. So we've got the first participants up and running. So there's a really basic process going, they're sharing information and they're wrapping that into a wider process that they take part in to make sure that we minimize the amount of information that's shared to what's absolutely necessary in line with data protection rules, but also protects against individuals or entities being unfairly prejudiced. So that's a kind of quick overview of the project.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan. Really appreciate that. And I'd love to get some views from the other panelists and then start the discussion around this. So let's kind of take a little bit of a step back and talk about how data sharing actually helps fight financial crime. So John, I'd love to turn to you first for a bit of a high level view on, from your perspective on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. So look, data sharing, information sharing, intelligence sharing, all these things have been around actually for a very long time. If you think about what the purpose of the AML-CFT regime is, it's to bring, in large part, the private sector into the fight against financial crime, whereas once it wasn't. And I remember going back 20 years when the idea was if only the private sector could help the public sector with information about bad guys, then we can go after the money and we can take the money out of crime and we can close down those loopholes. That's what we've been trying to achieve. And actually, I think we've been successful if you measure success by the number of suspicious activity reports that are filed. We're now talking about millions of pieces of information that are presented to law enforcement on an annualized basis right across the world. Some of it is not very good, we know. Estimates that at least 15% in the UK are just not even suspicious, and another probably double that is probably doesn't have a reasonable grounds for suspicion. But even then, you're still talking about significant pieces of information that are provided to law enforcement to go after the bad guys. And I pick you up on one thing, Gemma. I'll try not to do this very often, but you said that there's only been a small amount that's detected. I don't think we know that. There's only been a small amount that's been seized in relation to criminal assets. When it comes to detection, we're detecting stuff all the time. Right? And when it comes to prevention, we don't know how much we've prevented, probably a huge amount too. So we shouldn't be too tough on us. I think actually the state of play in relation to fighting financial crime is a lot better than people would give it credit for. But ultimately, unless we go after the assets and see some more assets less than the 1%, of course, we're going to be underplaying all of that. So information sharing's been at the very, very heart of the AML-CFT regime. We're all pretty comfortable with it, but it is predicated upon a very clear set of obligations. And it's also predicated on a very clear sets of laws and regulations. But it's also predicated on private sector give public sector information. And in theory, you get feedback, which you don't, generally speaking, in relation to that information. So it makes the public sector's job, it gives them information, but it makes the private sector's job in relation to, okay, so what do I do next once I provided that level of information? I think where we are now is we want to do information sharing in lots of different ways, not just the standard SAR reporting process, which we know is in certain need of reform. And that reform is underway, but we're looking now towards doing other things, like, for example, information sharing from law enforcement to the private sector. And you'll see some of these public-private partnerships that have been set up around the world that are meant to try and do that. And that comes in a number of different forms: strategic when it comes to typologies, tactical when it comes to names and specific information. Both of those are really quite helpful. And then you're starting going in where Jonathan, you were talking about, which is the private to private information sharing, which we'd like to see more of. And then you've got the private to civil society and NGOs that are establishing, and we'll come on to some of those too. I think the most important thing with all these information sharing initiatives, though, is not to get ahead of ourselves or be overly ambitious. Okay, let's be very clear what the purpose of these things are. Let's be very clear what the outcomes of these things are. Let's not get into the mess that we've got ourselves in relation to a significant part of the SARs that we file that either people don't want or don't use, right, and cost a fortune to produce, albeit 10% or so is really extremely valuable. Let's not get into that mess and replicate that in the private sector. So be really clear on purpose, be really clear on outcomes. And last point I'd make is, don't become a policeman when you're not a policeman, unless you've got policemen involved in your initiative, right? There's a limit to what you can do with private to private information sharing, unless you've got somewhere to give that extra information and somebody to go and do something really important with that. Gemma, I'll stop there. We'll come back to some of the specifics, I think, later.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. I think really valuable insight, and I think good advice for those sort of wider programs around information sharing. So let's turn now to Mike Moate from Countingup to hear a little bit about some day-to-day experiences that he and his teams have encountered over the years.
Yes, I think there's two things I'd like to talk about. The first is a kind of direct result of our partnership within the FFE. So the police are now using the FFE community to disseminate DPA requests, particularly where they're high profile, perhaps relate to terrorism, to most of the fintechs in the UK and beyond. So we received one of these and we interrogated our systems and discovered that we actually had an application that we had rejected as outside of our risk appetite with no other grounds of suspicion that was a match to this. As part of that application, the applicant had disclosed a social media account in support. And so we were able to wrap that all up and provide that to the police in response to that DPA. And that's not something that would have been disclosed otherwise. We had no grounds for suspicion. It was just outside of our risk appetite. It would have just sat there on our books. So I think that sort of shows the power of the network and working with the security services and the police. And to John's point, getting relevant information rather than perhaps the noise of the SAR system to the right people. And the other thing I'm very passionate about is a new fintech entering the market is quite literally inundated with all of the bad actors that all of their previous fintech colleagues have identified and dealt with. And this keeps happening, and you hit people when they're most vulnerable, when their controls are untested and unproven. And I think something like a data sharing initiative can make a huge difference there to letting people enter the market and give their controls and systems time to get battle hardened rather than being inundated.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think hopefully a number of our FFE members would agree with that. And not least from just the simple typology sharing, which I think goes some way to that. But I think this addition of sharing more detailed data would be, as you say, a really welcome addition to that suite of information sharing. And then so final one on this question, Kristen, would love to kind of hear your thoughts from an FATF perspective. Clearly, you're working in a really relevant area on the current project you're working on. So yeah, it would be great to get your views.
Thank you. And yeah, as I mentioned, so the FATF just launched a new project. We're looking at new technologies that facilitate information sharing between financial institutions. So this private to private information sharing for AML CFT purposes. And what we're trying to look at and encourage in terms of information sharing between financial institutions is to address the problem that you noted in your introduction, where criminals often engage multiple financial institutions to hide their illicit activities or hide their money laundering activities, but the information this activity cannot be detected based on a single institution's transaction information alone. It can only be identified when that information is shared more broadly. So that's one of the areas of focus for this new project within the FATF. But also, as Mike noted, private-to-private information sharing can also be used to enhance the shared understanding of money laundering and terrorist financing trends and typologies. It can build off of this sharing of trend and typology information that occurs in public-private partnerships. And so it can build off of that information based on the information that's held by the institutions as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a really important way of kind of rounding out that picture, and I'm really thrilled that FATF has decided to start to focus on it. So I'm really excited to hear the reports or the results, sorry, of your report as they come out. So moving on, let's talk about some of the challenges. We know that sharing data is tricky. There are legal issues, there are risk appetite issues. And there are some issues that are absolutely black and white, legal issues, and then there are some where it falls into the grey area and it falls to a point of interpretation, and it's tough for firms to tread the right line in that space. So, Jonathan, coming at this from ComplyAdvantage's perspective, and having seen some of the results from the data sharing working group that we're running as part of our data sharing initiative, can you just talk us through some of the main points of challenge from those sessions?
Yeah, sure. So I guess, as you'd expect, there's a number of issues that were raised around the mechanics and the basic kind of tech enablement to manage security and complying with data protection and privacy concerns. But really, the key challenge that we've spent most of our effort kind of grappling with, if you like, is exploring the ways in which participants can share information such that it can be effectively used to improve risk management, whilst balancing off the concerns about tipping off and unfairly prejudicing. And it's really that dimension that's proved the hardest one to overcome. There are plenty of sort of well understood ways of tackling and dealing with the other issues, but that one has been the most challenging. And I guess the approach that we've taken to this so far has been to distinguish between sharing intelligence that suggests the need for further investigation by participants versus sharing evidence or assessments of risk, which would clearly be much more problematic from a legal point of view. But equally importantly, it wouldn't necessarily actually be the most useful thing to share from a business process perspective, because the assessment of risk takes into account a much wider context and is going to be different between different participants, different circumstances, products, and so on. And so it's from both those perspectives, it makes more sense to share something which indicates the need for further work, and that further work is what then drives decision making off the back of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good summary, and I think perfectly kind of encapsulates some of the challenging discussions that we've had, but also then I think underscores why we've taken the approach that we have taken and focus quite heavily on this notion of kind of intelligence sharing rather than, as you say, an actual assessment or sort of any sort of basis of evidence. So thank you for that, Jonathan. John, how does that compare to approaches you've seen in the wider banking or more traditional banking sector, shall we say?
Yeah, look, I think, you go back to 9/11, for example, and you see the lessons from 9/11, which were summarized in the Patriot Act, for example. And there was a failure of intelligence. There was a failure of intelligence sharing across numbers of institutions within the US government. And as a result of that, a lot of changes happened, which make, you would hope, the US a lot safer to this kind of event. They also passed 314A and B of the Patriot Act, which allowed information should be shared from the public sector to the private sector and from the private sector to the private sector on the 314B. Nobody else has done that. And that was back in 2001, 2002, right, when in response to something that was fairly seismic, and the privacy agenda wasn't quite as significant as it is today because of various different issues that we're all aware of. When we go back to the original FATF rules and standards, you got recommendation 20 on the self-filing, which is a private to public sector information sharing protocol. There really isn't a FATF requirement in relation to information sharing the other way around. And one of the things we really want to do is to get information from the public sector, which is relevant and specific and precise, plus typologies, which we've always had a bit of, and start using that information, because the information that we get only leads to exits, right? And only leads to SAR filing. So that's been really important. And we haven't had enough of that as we'd like. Okay. Now, it's interesting, Gemma, the phrase that this session is described as is dare to share. Right? And that phrase comes from actually Theresa May back in 2015 when she hosted this breakfast meeting, which I attended. And she said to the banks in the meeting, you guys have, she was the Home Secretary before she became the Prime Minister of the UK. And she said, you guys need to dare to share more information with the public sector. It was sort of mentioned that the private sector shouldn't need to dare to share. It should actually have laws and regulations which allowed it to actually not commit criminal offences, which the Home Secretary was there to uphold. But we got the message. But also during the course of that discussion, there was a discussion around why doesn't the public sector then dare to share information with the private sector, especially on things like terrorism. And of course, things have changed since 2015. You've got GIMLIT, public-private partnerships, where actually information is beginning to flow, albeit tactical and not industrial, right, in relation to that. Those are much more productive than the many things that we do. We haven't yet found a mechanism for institutionalizing those or industrializing those, but it's work in progress. In the absence of good information being shared by the public sector to the private sector, there aren't many other places to go and get intelligence or information apart from your peers and people that are doing the same thing that you're doing. And our network now is much bigger than it used to be. It used to be a bunch of banks. Now it's not. It's all you guys too, plus a lot of other people who are sharing a piece of that picture, that puzzle, and that picture has got more complicated, and the people that need to decipher that picture and that puzzle have got much more numerous in relation to who those people are. So in the absence of getting really good information from the public sector, we have no choice but to share information amongst ourselves. That doesn't mean that's my first priority. But in the absence of that, I think we should be pushing that forward. But in order to be able to do that, we need to do that on a legal basis. And the legal bases aren't easy to ensure that you come within those legal bases. They haven't been provided or presented in a way that the SAR filing regime has been created and presented. And we need to think about those. And I know, Kristen's doing that, and FATF are thinking about how to do that now. And we really need those. Privacy is not a bad thing, it's a good thing for all of us. Right? We're not against privacy by doing information sharing. Right? We're not at all, but there are consequences from the privacy agenda. And there are some people in the privacy agenda who want to be collaborative. And there are some people who feel just as much as I feel about fighting financial crime as they feel about defending privacy. So we've got to find a common way, and that common way is not as easy as people think. Technology can help, but it is not simply the answer. Technology, including privacy enhancing technologies, do not help you unless you have a legal gateway in the first place to do what you're supposed or you want to be able to do. So there isn't a technology solution to this. Technology enables a solution once we've agreed what it is we're allowed to do. Last point, we want to do more information sharing within the public sector, within the private sector. We want to be able to do that. We think it's very, very useful and will have significant outcomes as a result. But we also want to get much better at getting information from the public sector, and they need to dare to share more.
Yeah, I think some fantastic points there, John. Thank you for summarising them. And I think, yeah, I agree. We want to do more sharing, private to private. We'd love to hear a bit more from the public sector. I think even I've been on panels recently talking about how geopolitics can affect financial crime trends. So even hearing those kind of more strategic assessments about country risk and those strategic threats would be incredibly valuable to something like the financial sector. So I'm all for that and completely agree. You also talked about the US, and so I think it's pertinent to note that the current data sharing initiative that we're working on is only within the UK. And so clearly, when you start thinking about crime, you start thinking about the motivations of criminals to move their money, obfuscate the origin of funds by using the international framework. Clearly, that data sharing needs to take place, not only within country borders, but also cross-border. So I would love to kind of hear the panel's views on this kind of notion of, well, like clearly we need the legal basis to share within a country first, but how do we then take that to be more global? I don't know if Kristen or Mike, if you've got some opening thoughts you could share on that.
I can jump in first, and this ties to the last question as well about some of the challenges that have been identified in relation to information sharing. So in the course of our research, we've also identified a number of challenges that go beyond just the data privacy and protection requirements that are in place, both nationally and supranationally. But a number of challenges have been identified in our very preliminary research. And this includes, as you mentioned, the FATF's STR tipping off requirements, the explainability and interpretability of new technologies that would be used by financial institutions to be able to share information between each other. There's also the issue about data quality and data standardization. And this would be a challenge both nationally, but then when you talk about trying to exchange or share information cross-border, this data standardization will also become more and more prevalent. There's also data localization requirements, which would also become an obstacle for cross-border information sharing that would be a challenge to overcome as well. There's also the issue of technology costs. So any advanced or developing technologies come at a cost, and that could be a reason why some financial institutions are not implementing or deploying these types of technologies. There's also the issue about competition between market participants, where some financial institutions have reluctance to share information with their market competitors. And then, of course, there's the big issue of cybersecurity and ensuring that any personal information or data that is pooled in a cloud or exchanged or shared is secure and doesn't get into the wrong hands. So that's a really a very important aspect of this work, whether the information sharing is occurring nationally or cross-border. But cross-border information sharing is more of a challenge because then you get into this issue about data localization requirements as well as very important data privacy and protection requirements as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kristen. I think, again, excellent points there. And, I think this cross-border world, like, it just opens up a whole suite of opportunities for intelligence sharing. As we say, we know like criminals are not bound by borders, but at the same time, a whole host of other challenges from that legal basis perspective. Mike, was there anything you wanted to add on this point?
I think there's also a big issue around identity in a cross-border scenario. How do you know you're talking about the same people or the same entities? There are wildly different approaches to this across the world. In the US, you've got the ubiquitous social security number to uniquely identify every person. We don't have an equivalent in the UK. You've got the likes of Estonia, where every individual has a ID card and a digital identity, and they can cryptographically sign transactions. That's wonderful. The rest of the world is nowhere near there yet. And then thinking about my space particularly, also businesses. How do you uniquely identify a business? We are largely fortunate in the UK to have Companies House as the official register. In many other countries, there is not an equivalent. In the US in particular, that mostly seems to be in the hands of a number of private sector companies and not easy to get hold of. So I think identity is a big challenge to global information sharing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a really good point. And like you say, not limited between individuals and companies. There are definitely challenges on both sides. Let's move on though and talk a little bit about some of the technology opportunities here. And so, Jonathan, I think you touched on some of this in your sort of opening gambit around the project that we're working on. And so I'd love to kind of hear your views about, like, is privacy enhancing technology kind of essential to this program, or is it just more of a potential enabler in the background?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And obviously it's something that the FCA tech sprint last year looked at, for example. I mean, I think privacy enhancing technologies, although it's a bit of a mouthful to say, they're quite well named. They do what they say on the tin. So they're designed to be privacy enhancing. So their superpower is being able to reduce the amount of information that needs to be shared in order to achieve some desired objective, and to reduce the amount of information further than was previously possible. So they're really clever. But they're not, at the same time, they're not tipping off guarding against technologies or prejudice avoiding technologies. They're privacy enhancing. And so we still need to develop business processes that deliver value and help participants to do their job of crime fighting and all the rest of it in a way that ensures that those aspects are looked after, as well as purely the privacy point. So I think the privacy enhancing technologies, it's so much of a mouthful I can't even say. They are a really useful tool, and as John said, they can be applied as an enabler once you're clear what you're sharing. But I think not only do you have to have some legal gateway to share that could be enabled by privacy enhancing technology, you also need to make sure that all of the business processes wrapped around the use of that technology are taken into account. And I think the final point I would make is that it's when it comes to looking at compliance with all of these various rules and regulations, it's ultimately the processes that will be evaluated for compliance, not the little bits of technology that are enabling them. So I think that's the critical focus.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I love your point that they're privacy enhancing, not anti-tipping off enhancing, because yeah, my experience of being in those working groups around data sharing with the FFE was very much, it was actually that tipping off point that was kind of most concerning, and we've already had a couple of audience questions in from that, which I'll come to in a little bit. Mike, I've got to turn to you in this space. You're a chief technology officer, so would love to kind of get your thoughts on privacy enhancing technology. Is it a red herring? Is it something that's useful? Yeah, over to you.
I think it's definitely something that's useful, but it's about choosing the right privacy enhancing technology for what you actually want to do with the data. I think people naturally tend to jump to some of the newer, sexier things here, sort of homomorphic encryption, that sort of thing. Homomorphic encryption is great if you want to manipulate the data in certain ways, if you've got voting data and you want to add it up without revealing the underlying votes. In general, for the sort of information we're looking to share in the fin crime world, it's not actually super useful. Your sort of standard cryptographic one-way hash and then doing the same operation in order to search through a database of hashes is way more useful in terms of trying to see whether you've got a match to someone that's sort of on a list somewhere. So it's about choosing the right privacy enhancing technology and perhaps not getting swayed by the bright lights of exciting new tech, and the tried and trusted path tends to be more reliable.
Yeah, I think it's a great perspective. Anything, Kristen or John, from you to add to that point?
I like privacy enhancing technology. I like homomorphic encryption, but as I say, it's not a silver bullet. I also don't think PET is the right terminology for it. It's not privacy enhancing. We're not enhancing privacy. You've already got your privacy. What we're doing is taking it away from you. And then all we're doing is reducing the ability of that privacy to affect you negatively. So it's not privacy enhancing technology. It's actually, you've got that privacy already. We're going to expose your data to a process, albeit we're only going to expose the data that's absolutely necessary to that process and not actually capture lots of other stuff too. Right? So we're creating tunnels here, if you like, and connections, and we're not going to expose everybody else. It's privacy maintaining for everybody else, right? But it's not privacy enhancing for the particular piece involved. That being said, that's probably a detail. I like the thing more because it's more likely than not in a discussion with data protection officers that we're going to have to find some mechanism to explain why we're not opening up the entirety of the data books to this process, and it's going to be limited and therefore reasonable. You know, PETs may well be part of that discussion and may well be part of that solution. If they are, that's a good thing. I don't want us to get into a situation though whereby we're only ever talking about doing stuff with PETs, because it may be the case that actually we should be opening up stuff and having data pools that limited number of people, right, with the right kinds of credentials can actually be looking at things for our collective benefit But we shouldn't be doing that in the shadows. We should be doing that transparently. We should be agreeing that that's a good thing, and we should be getting positive outcomes out of that. Otherwise, we should then be shutting it down, right? So I don't want to restrict the debate to only the things we could possibly do in a very restrictive way with the best form of advanced technology. We should be taking a step back and saying what's possible, and then what are the consequences and the unintended consequences, and making a rational decision in relation to all of that.
Yeah, no, great points as ever. Thank you, John. Kristen, any points so far? I appreciate your research is at an early stage still. So
yeah, I think I agree with John's comment around the various new technologies that are emerging. We're currently conducting a stock take, so the FATF will look at all of the various technologies that are under development or currently deployed to facilitate this information sharing amongst financial institutions. So I can't really speak to the exact technologies that are being used. We're still finalizing the results of our questionnaire that was sent to technology experts in the industry. But what I can say is, regardless of the technology that's used, it's really important that they include parameters of what type of data is being shared and processed, and it's clear for what purpose. I think that is the most important thing when looking at each of the different technologies.
No, I think that's really helpful. Thank you, Kristen. So let's move on and talk about industry opportunities. We've got kind of an open, fairly agile fintech sector. We have more traditional incumbents who I think gradually are becoming more and more agile and who are becoming more open to some of these ideas. So yeah, I would love to turn to John again to hear about your experiences in the banking sector around information sharing in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. Look, there are lots. I can't tell you how many there are. Each week that goes by, there's usually a new announcement on some kind of information sharing or some kind of idea. I'm going to just pick a couple, which I think are really interesting, because I think they cover different stuff. You've got your classic PPP, like a Gimlet, which everybody's pretty much aware of. But there's 23 of those. Some are better than others, and some are at early stage, some at late development stage. I always thought that Gimlet itself and the PPP was not an end state. That's an initial state in order to build trust and confidence between public and private sector. And I think across the private sector, there's already that level of collaboration that we've seen over time. So I still want to see those move on to another level, a more productive level than the current situation. It can't be just enough. But if you haven't sat together in the public and private sector on a regular basis and talked about financial crime, you're never going to get to a situation where you get a data pooling, information sharing initiative that's something like what they're trying to do in the Netherlands, which is things like the transaction monitoring utility. Right? You're just not going to get there. They've had many years with their FIU, which is very forward thinking, working with a group of pretty much incumbents that cover a lot of the market there. And they've been working tremendously well together and having pretty good results for years, including a terrorism public-private partnership, which is very successful, and also a money laundering public-private partnership. And they're moving towards now actually having a common utility for transaction monitoring, which will go through different phases. And it's not phase 3 is not allowed under the law, which is data pooling, data sharing, and working with the FIU. So we'll see how that gets. But you see that development. So I would encourage people to start working with each other, but not on the basis of what you're going to build today is going to be the ultimate solution. You've got to build trust and confidence, and you've got to get some quick wins. The other one that I'd mention is Stop the Traffic's Traffic Analysis Hub, which has been built by Stop the Traffic, which is a UK NGO, great partner of Unseen, of course, in the UK, and has established a platform by an NGO to collect information on human trafficking from all around the world, mostly from NGOs, which come into its central database. And then that information is then provided to law enforcement and financial institutions, plus others, plus some businesses who want to manage their human trafficking risk in a better way. I never really envisaged we'd get to that stage 3 or 4 years ago, right? And so you're seeing this proliferation of information. It is a challenge in relation to what you can share. If Gemma Rogers comes onto my, into my platform, can I share that? Well, it depends, and it's not easy. But can I share addresses? Can I share certain commerce, certain information? Yes, I can. Is it useful? Yes, it is. but actually I'd like to see us be able to share some more. So you're seeing lots of different examples. You see the United for Wildlife Financial Task Force, the Transport Task Force, for example, another great example of NGOs leading public and private partnerships beyond the direction, if you like, of the traditional public sector. I would say, though, Gemma, that at the end of the day, no matter what we do in relation to information sharing, it only has really two big benefits. One, either it protects ourselves, so you've got a bad guy, you give it to me, he doesn't work with me. But that doesn't really have a big impact on society apart from protecting our own. Or the public sector get involved, in particular law enforcement, and they take that information, do something with it, either domestically or exchange that information internationally. And I'm always struck by, unless we have some angle where law enforcement get involved and want to get involved and want to use this information, it's only ever going to be the former, and we're not going to really address, the things that Kristen and her team at FATF are really focused on. So really encouraging law enforcement to come and join us and come and make the best of what we're doing is really important, and they're doing that. But I think also we hope that they will do that even more in the future.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. Appreciate that. Mike, sort of countering that with the experience in fintech, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, obviously, I don't disagree with anything John's saying. I think one of the challenges for a lot of sort of small, agile, nimble fintechs is the kind of lack of agility and tech savviness as soon as you start dealing with the public sector. The tooling around SARS in the UK is, as everyone knows, woeful, and indeed sucks up a vast amount of time just to meet our regulatory obligations. So we're kind of crying out for some innovation in that space. And that's where the data sharing project is quite good, in that we're able to work with ComplyAdvantage, who themselves are obviously very technically savvy, and build solutions that are the sort of solution that a fintech would want to consume and would choose to consume, rather than some of the legacy systems that we are forced to use and consume. And that lets us do very tight integrations around sort of moving some of this data around where that's appropriate, so that doesn't tend to involve humans, and that's obviously very efficient and avoids any mistakes. So I think kind of from the day-to-day operational fintech, that's something we need to get better at, and with the public sector, and the public sector needs to get better at. Clearly the SAR portal in the UK needs overhaul, and I'm sure the same is true in many other countries.
Yeah, it feels like, particularly in the SAR space, I know there are sort of options to automate some of the sort of uploading of certain information to SAR portals, which is great. But it feels like that learning maybe could be shared a little bit more with the law enforcement community to sort of maybe flag some of the actual operational issues that you get, even in something that is as we say, a regulatorily stipulated process that we need to follow. Jonathan,
yeah,
obviously oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I think, yes, there are systems to automate the SAR portal, but that's really a giant sticking plaster over the underlying problem, which is that it was never built for integration in the first place. And that's really what we'd like to see addressed. Yeah,
definitely. Jonathan, you've obviously got experience through your work at ComplyAdvantage with a range of industries, because obviously it's not only financial institutions that use your products and services. So what's your perspective on these broader industry opportunities? Is there someone out there that's doing it really well and that the financial services industry needs to catch up with?
Yeah, so I guess there's a lot of the data sharing and information sharing type initiatives tend to focus, I think, on sharing the actual risk of information itself, and either a transaction time or onboarding time, as the project we're engaged in at the moment. But I think if we take a step back, there's another part of the process, which is matching the person or entity you're doing business or about to do business with to that risk information. And as we sort of tackle some of the challenges through the project we're engaged in at the moment, I do wonder, I think there may be at least as much impact that can be had with the industry coming together to help tackle that problem through data sharing. In other words, to do a better job collectively of doing entity resolution and understanding whether the person or entity I'm about to do business with relates to that piece of risk information that's out there in the world or not. that may present an easier path through some of the issues when we're trying to make these trade-offs between tipping off and privacy and data protection and so on. As Mike referred to, fintechs are already leading the way in automating and sort of technology optimizing their processes around entity resolution, around tying in the identity and verification step in with all the other parts of the process. And so I think there may well be an opportunity for that type of organization, for that part of the industry to lead the way in using this kind of approach around data sharing to improve entity resolution, to improve the matching, and use that to transform risk management almost sort of through the side door, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And yeah, I know lots of firms have problems with entity resolution and data matching. And it's another one of those things that takes up a huge amount of manual processing time that could otherwise be spent tackling what I would argue is true financial crime. So no, great points, thank you. And then Kristen, obviously appreciate you're early in the research you're doing, but what's the response rate been like from the people that you have contacted to get involved with your project?
Yeah, the response rate has been pretty high. So today is actually the deadline for the questionnaire that we circulated to industry experts. So we asked what this is a stock take analysis. So we asked what technology is currently under development or being deployed, for what purpose, what results are being achieved, what stage of development or deployment is this new technology. And what we've seen a lot is that a lot of any new technology that's being used to facilitate information sharing is really in its nascent stages or in a pilot phase or even in testing phases. There's very few examples that we can point to where we say, okay, this has been around for a period of time and we can really see results on a longer term. An area of focus for this project is we really want to look at what the drivers were for the development and deployment of these technologies. Was it all industry driven, or was it through a public-private partnership, or was it encouraged by AML/CFT regulators and supervisors? We also want to examine and identify some of the preconditions that enabled the use of this technology. And then it gives us a better idea of what the FATF could do moving forward in the second phase of this work after it's completed its initial stock take and examined the environment of technology that's currently in the market now, and then see where the FATF can make a meaningful contribution to the space moving forward, and whether, for example, best practices or guidance is needed, or whether the FATF should possibly look at its own standards.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great. And from what we've talked about, yeah, having centralized standards, like having any of this kind of legal regulatory basis for completing the sharing, I think would really sort of move these initiatives forward quite considerably. So speaking of initiatives, there are a couple out there already. There's an initiative in Holland, there's one in Estonia as well. And obviously we've got the one that Jonathan and ComplyAdvantage, FINTRAIL, FFE have been working on. Yeah, just keen to get any thoughts on those ongoing initiatives, perhaps turning straight back to you, Kristen. And I appreciate you can't kind of sanction or bless any of these at all, given your position in FATF, but any sort of overarching observations?
Yeah, I think with the two models that you referenced, both the Dutch and Estonian model, they're really trying to address this problem of criminals using multiple institutions to hide their criminal activities and their money laundering activities. So the intent is to share transaction information. I think it's incredibly interesting area of development, and for me, it really highlights the need for industry to have to work cooperatively and collaboratively with AML/CFT national authorities. For the TMNL, for example, national legislative amendments are required in order to get this initiative up and running. So it really underscores the importance of working together with and having buy-in by national authorities, because it cannot just be an industry-driven initiative. I think also the two models both demonstrate the need for industry not just to work with AML/CFT regulators and supervisors, but also to work with their data privacy and protection authorities. and to do a proper impact assessment in terms of data privacy and protection. I think that's a very important aspect, as well as clearly defining the parameters around what data can be shared and for what purpose. I think those are probably my main takeaways from these case studies that are emerging now.
Yeah, I think great points, and I agree that a data protection impact assessment is absolutely critical. I know that was really central to the efforts that we made on our project, and I think did help to get people a little bit more comfortable with how that was working. John, any thoughts from you on those initiatives?
Yeah. Before I get into that, I think the environment in which we're all operating is actually, there's a lot of segmentation going on that we never had before, right? And that's because of you guys, and that's, you know, in large part a really good thing, and you'll definitely think it's a really good thing. If you're part of the incumbents, you might not think it's such a great thing. I was sitting with a bank that's got a European bank that's got a significant part of one country's domestic payments, right, and then got a significant number of accounts. And their ability to be able to see what their customers doing these days versus 5 years ago is much less than it ever was before. Right, because all the payments that customer did with that one particular bank, including all its retail payments and expenses, was pretty transparent to that financial institution. So when you're generating an alert and doing an investigation, and you're going through, does this make sense? Is it suspicious or not? And actually, all you've got is a third-party, you know, fintech, and that's all you've got, and a debit or a credit. That's all you see, and the significant amount of that is going on more than ever before, which is a good thing. Right? But it does mean that actually we're all seeing smaller pieces than we've ever done before. Now, fintechs may see a bit more, but they're only going to see a piece of that too. So if that's true, which it is true, then what are we going to do about all of that? Right? That's a challenge to us all. We either just say that so be it, right? In which case we all file a whole bunch of SARs that are not really suspicious, or we can't really do our investigations, and then we gum up the system again, right? Or we find a mechanism to be able to exchange information in a way that is helpful to us all, so we can all do our jobs and make our responsibilities better, right? That's the first point. I think it's really important, that one. Second is, don't underestimate the fact that some of the most important things that we do on information sharing is not big data pooling with problems about privacy, right? The things we now know about terrorism finance because we talk to each other, which is not sharing the name of the terrorist, by the way. The things we know about fraud, which is different to money laundering, because actually there's always an event and there's money lost, so it's a real case, not just a suspicion. The things we know about money mules today versus 5 years ago, and the things which are important to this conference, in particular on human trafficking and the red flags and the way we identify human trafficking, which we never did before, that information exchange is really important. And that just takes collaboration, and that just takes good people getting together and sharing how they were successful in doing it with people who aren't successful in doing it. Right? That's really important. Doesn't take any change in law, doesn't take anything. The other stuff, though, around this piece around if we do pool our data, will we see things, or if we do work together, will we get better results? I'll go back to the Dutch Terrorism Finance Task Force. In Holland, the suspicious activity reports, or the UTRs, as they call them, that are filed in relation to terrorism finance, there's about a 10% conversion rate on those. Right? In other words, 1 out of 10 are considered to be somewhere in the region of useful to law enforcement or intelligence agencies on a TF notification. The notifications that come out of the TF task force are about 64% following a study. Right? That tells you something really important, which is that going through that public-private partnership and sharing information and understanding the nature of the threat better means you can do a much better job, you get rid of all the noise, and you produce things that people really, really want to see. Right? That's public-private partnership in its best. It's not industrialized, but it's where we are. It goes there. If you want to know about financial information sharing partnerships, big shout out to one of our members, Rusi, and the future of financial information sharing. Nick Maxwell's reviewed all of this stuff, you know, all 23, and there's another 200, you know, that they're going to review at some stage, but all the 23, and they're all on a journey, and people need to get on that journey. But it's not just about a gimlet, right? It's about a number of different things, and let's not conflate all of them together. Everyone who's joined this conference this week, today, can make a difference by collaborating in relation to what they don't know, what they know, to get something back in relation to what they don't know. And then we start building upon those in relation to some of the things that Jonathan was talking about on the more sexy end, if you like, of the information sharing spectrum. So let's not put it into one particular bucket. Let's see that there's benefits in lots of different places. Last point, Gemma. There are gateways that exist like 314B in the US that are being exploited significantly and have a significant effect because of the force multiplier effect of those people that are able to share. It's pretty obvious that that would be beneficial. That doesn't apply in most other countries. We need more gateways. There's a gateway in the UK on the Gimlet. There's also a new gateway on post-suspicion information sharing, but just for banks in the UK. That has not yet been used because there are some legal issues around that, some concerns, but it's getting pretty close to getting the green light to be used. We can't ask people like Kristen to give us new laws and regulations unless we prove that essentially the ones that are out there are being used and are successful, like the Netherlands TF task force. It's successful. TMNL in Netherlands, we don't know yet, albeit we're convinced it will be successful, right? So let's all try and do stuff that's positive. Let's make sure we share the results. Let's lobby that those results need to get support, and then we'll get people from privacy who'll be sitting there and they'll have a difficult conversation with us as long as we provide safeguards there as well.
Yeah, no, fantastic points as ever. Thank you, John. Jonathan, moving over to the data sharing initiative that we're working on, why is it different to some of these other initiatives?
Yeah, I guess at the risk of sort of belaboring the point, the focus tends to be, because we're talking about data sharing, to focus on the data that's being shared. I guess it's only natural. But effectively, what I think we've certainly ended up focusing on, and has been kind of the critical issue, is the process. So it's really a case of looking at the processes that each individual participant, in our case it's private to private sector, so each individual institution is doing, and working out where are there ways to tie those together such that they would be more effective, they would get their jobs done better, faster, quicker, cheaper. And almost sort of designing a better process integration with that's unconstrained by the fact that today almost none of that information is shared between those institutions, and then asking, okay, so what's the minimum that would need to be shared in order to make that process work in that way. As I alluded to earlier, it needn't be the case of sharing a suspicion or sharing evidence or an assessment or what have you. It could be something as simple as today, each institution wants to work out whether the person or entity they're about to onboard matches any risk information that's out there, who's on a sanctions list, etc. And they search and they get information back, and you get a whole load of results, and you have to wade through those and work out whether those results match to your customer. And to sort of build on the example that Mike quoted earlier, it's heavily constrained at the moment based on what each individual institution can see about that customer. What have they been told? But actually collectively, what we know about that customer or entity is much greater. So are there ways we could tie our processes together to make use of that collective information, so we can do a better job of linking that customer to that piece of information? So there's a lot of, I mean, that's right down there in a weed, in a detail somewhere, but it can make a big difference to the ability of institutions to sift through that, to make connections where those need making, to make the right risk-based decisions when they're faced with customers onboarding, for example. So I think it's that sort of approach is the difference in what we've done, is looked at the business process and how to design better ones of those, as it happens, enabled by data sharing under the bonnet.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jonathan. We've actually had a question in from the audience, which I think kind of picks up on that theme, which I'll throw to you, but I'm also happy to chip in on. So Rob Reeve asks, how are you going to ensure the sharing and creation of, he says suspect list, but that's not a term we use, to be clear, but the information shared does not lead to financial exclusion?
Yeah, I mean, and I guess it's just this point. So we've had a lot of discussions with the participants and with legal experts around exactly what process needs to occur within the participant organisation that drives their decision making as to how they make that risk-based decision. And so we're not sharing between an assessment from one participant to another, or a red flag or a suspicion or what have you. We're sharing an indication that further investigation is warranted effectively. But it's that further investigation that needs to drive the decision making within each participant.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and very much kind of in line with points within GDPR about not using kind of one single piece of information as your decisioning factor on any client suitability is kind of very intrinsic to the way we've approached it. So yeah, thanks for tackling that one, Jonathan. Mike, don't want to leave you out of the discussion about these Dutch Estonian models, but also keen to hear your perspectives on or your experience of the data sharing initiative thus far with ComplyAdvantage and ourselves. What kind of benefits do you expect to see from the data sharing initiative for your company?
I think the main thing for us is adding another input to our risk scoring that will hopefully be of very high quality given the likely sources for that input. But as to Jonathan's point, it is just an input. It's never something you'd make a decision on its own. It'd be very useful to take that high quality input and overlay that with some of the lower quality inputs. I'm sure we've all enjoyed kind of the joys of adverse media and the potentially thousands of matches that can come out of that. It's also a space I'd love to see some innovation in. I think if the article was published before the subject you're asking about was born, it's fairly safe to say that's not a match, but I've not yet seen a product that can actually do that. So I guess that would be the primary benefit. And then the secondary benefit is, ideally, I'd love to see the incumbent larger institutions start to open up a bit more to the fintech community. I'm sure I can speak for a number of members that trying to tell an incumbent bank that they potentially have a problem is very difficult. They will usually not talk to you. So whilst trying to do the right thing and trying indeed to help them out, you can't really get anywhere and you get stonewalled. And so hopefully if we can build something of value, maybe that can help grease the wheels there and start to open up those communications.
Yeah, no, I think that's and that's definitely, I think, one of the intentions is yes, it's wonderful to have it as a fintech centric initiative, and we've got a great community among the fintech. We've built some of that trust already, so sharing is therefore eased somewhat, but it would be great to get those kind of wider players in there, and this is all with a view to fight financial crime, because this is exactly how criminals manipulate the system. Is they're not just going to pick fintechs, they're not just going to pick incumbent banks to use to launder their profits. So great. And then while I've got you, Mike, I'm going to throw one of the audience questions at you, which from James Emin. So he's asking, obviously we've got kind of a lot of incumbents who are still, very, very prominent within particularly kind of the retail banking market, and clearly, fintechs are sort of penetrating those markets. But he's asked a question about how do the sort of differing data infrastructures between those institutions, and is one more immature than the other, and whether that affects kind of our ability to share between and among each other. Would love your view on that, Mike, as a CTO.
I mean, I think obviously if you're still operating in a predominantly paper-based environment, things are going to be challenging. I think it's okay to disclose that actually the initial data sharing prototype that we've been working with is far from the tightly integrated, super technical platform we would hope for, although we know we're going to get there. So, I mean, we're uploading CSV data at the moment. That should be within reach of most organizations, I would have thought. We obviously want to move away from that, as do ComplyAdvantage, but it's an option that could be left there as a very basic entry level kind of ability. So I think it's not so much about whether you've got a data warehouse, it's whether you've actually got mature enough processes and systems to have surfaced intelligence that's valuable. If you've got those in place, then that intelligence is something you can contribute, and level of technology isn't going to be a barrier there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think probably Jonathan from Comply would agree, given the focus of the project on those kind of business processes rather than necessarily sort of really complex piece of technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And then just to round off a couple more audience questions, so we can keep these brief. That'd be great. So Tony Abar has asked, and I think I'll pass this one to John. How do the FIUs support any data and information sharing efforts? I think maybe just looking for a little bit more information on how precisely an FIU might get involved as opposed to sort of perhaps wider law enforcement.
Yeah, sure. So they're all different, Gemma. You've got, everyone's different, and I've sat in many of the different meetings in different parts of the world and discussed various different initiatives. Some are focused very much on 1 or 2 predicate offences. Some are much broader based than that. Some have strategic working groups where they're thinking about some of the issues around getting joined up in relation to SAR reform and the wider context. Some are very much in the weeds in relation to certain particular cases that they're looking at. So there really isn't one size fits all. The original idea, though, was for public sector and private sector to be able to sit down in a shared space and be able to talk with each other and listen to each other in relation to specific and precise cases, which would then benefit from that discussion, which could then continue and something could be done about that, right? That's the core of those public-private partnerships. And those, you can see the stats. Again, go to Nick Maxwell's information. You'll see a lot of the stats around the PPPs around the world. They're pretty good, but they're not going to move the dial in relation to fighting financial crime, because they're basically a collection of human beings who are doing things not off the side of their desk, but not that far away. And the funding for these particular issues comes out of current funding, and it's not part of an initiative that's seen as being something significant. Once you start moving into the Netherlands TMNL piece, you start talking about significant tens of millions over years, right? And you then are going to see a sea change in relation to the outcomes, which I think is worth the investment. But it's a significant investment to move from tactical to strategic and operational, and most people haven't done that yet.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, and appreciate you tackling that question. There is one more question that does take us back to privacy enhancing technologies and whether or not it's better to use a decentralized model that can be tailored to the organization, jurisdiction and regulators, given all of the sort of huge array of different policy, regulatory and security issues. Again, interested to get kind of maybe the policy view from Kristen and a technical view from Mike or Jonathan on that one.
So, sorry, Gemma, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so this is a question someone anonymously has asked. So if there is a vast array of policy, regulatory and security issues around data sharing, is the better approach using privacy enhancing technology to engage a decentralized model that can be tailored to the organization, jurisdiction and regulator? Sounds great in theory to me, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, I think this goes this goes to the point that John was making earlier, that technology is not the only solution. It's not the panacea. It will not solve all of these very important policy considerations that are in place for oftentimes very important reasons. So technology, well, it is going to be an area of focus in our project, where we're going to look at how has technology facilitated information sharing, but it is not the solution to the challenges that have been identified, whether the challenge is cybersecurity, data privacy, data protection, or data localization laws. I think an important element is ensuring that you have the correct regulatory measures in place and the legislation in place before you start looking to technology to be the solution to these measures.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm inclined to agree, but yeah, so go ahead, John.
Just on that, so it's information sharing. There's lots of it going on. So look at information exchange for tax purposes across the world, right? We have a whole model that's been built on the basis of, if you've got a bank account in one country and you're a citizen of another, that information gets collected and gets sent back to the revenue jurisdiction of your domicile. I've always been shocked that we only do that for tax, right? But we've got a model that does that. But then when it comes into that jurisdiction, you can only use it for tax. You can't use it for terrorism, finance, or organized crime, by the way. right? That's a protocol, right? That's a law, that's a regulation. That's not PET that's going to help us do that. We've decided that we want to do that for tax because it generates revenues for states, and states want to support that, and we understand all of that. But that exists already. We can do all of that stuff, right? We have choices in relation to all of these different things. When we talk about information that's in the public sector and needs to get out to the private sector, and that private sector is now a lot bigger than it used to be, that's harder than it ever used to be, right? But we can fix that if we want to do that, and we put privacy protections in place at the same time. Vice versa, in the private sector, if we want to share information with each other, we can do that subject to data protection, what information is going, the gateway that we've got, the jurisdiction that we're in, all those kinds of things. I think the opportunity we've got before us is quite significant, but the challenges are also there. And we need a bit more leadership from the public sector, not you, Kristen, not you guys, but actually the public sector. It shouldn't be the private sector designing new models as to how to fight financial crime.
Yeah, thank you, John. Well said. So I think what I'm going to do is just to start to wrap up now. I think we've kind of tackled most of the audience questions we've had in. So thank you to our audience for interacting with us in that way. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I kind of hope you continue to follow the efforts in this space beyond this panel, but hopefully you've had a really good insight into some of the issues that exist within the data sharing space, but also some of the opportunities. So I'm just going to close off by kind of going around our panelists and asking kind of, if you could do one thing to enable data sharing, what would that one thing be? Mike, let's start with you.
It's a bit of a cliche, but I think the one thing I can do is try and make the initial phase of the data sharing project that the FFE is undertaking a success, and you know, Countingup as one of the earliest participants, sharing company data, and we'll do all we can to make that successful and valuable.
Yeah, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to yourself particularly, but also the wider company Countingup for being such an ardent supporter of it. We've really appreciated your feedback and input. Has been incredibly valuable, so thank you. Kristen, how about you?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think right now it's currently what I'm working on. It's really to take a stock take to look at what technology is being used or considered to facilitate information sharing, and to really identify for what purpose, what information is being shared, and what are the results that the sharing is intended to achieve. And then identifying any of the challenges or obstacles for the broader deployment of these technologies for information sharing purposes. Because I really think we can only make any meaningful contribution to the space with first really identifying what the problem is and what the technology exists and for what purpose.
Great, thanks, Kristen. John?
I'm going to ask Kristen for 314B, please. What I really want, you give that, and you'll see the creative juices of all the people here come up with amazing solutions. Without that, it's going to be limited. It's going to be a hard road, and we're going to find ways of doing it, yes, but it's going to be tricky. I would make the final point here. We're talking about voluntary initiatives here. These voluntary initiatives are only ever going to be successful if you have good reputations, right? Which means you've got to do the J job really, really well. Right? It means not falling over. It means doing good compliance. Right? It means, you know, complying with the requirements and getting there. We all know that's hard enough. So don't set your stall on coming up with nice, fancy new PPPs and partnerships and then leave the back door wide open. Because if you do, you'll kill yourselves, you'll kill your colleagues, and you'll kill the industry. And Kristen and her colleagues won't listen to us. Yeah,
I agree with that. And I think it's a real founding principle of the FFE, and why we're so excited to be part of the global coalition as well, is to really help solidify efforts and make sure that the ecosystem retains that strength and that commitment to compliance. Jonathan, coming to you finally, you know, how would you like the community to respond to this panel, and what can they do to support the initiative that we're running?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to give a shameless plug for more participants in the project, in the trial between ComplyAdvantage and FFE. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's clearly a big mountain to climb here in moving towards using data sharing. I think to John's point, there's there are some bigger enablers that could really set this in trial. But given where we are, trying to find ways to use data sharing to get the day job done more efficiently and effectively is a good place to start. And there's not many better places to start doing that than joining our trial. Though I would say that, wouldn't I? And I think the final point I'd make on that is the trial we're doing, as I say, is focused on finding effective ways to join up business processes. So we really need more participants, even if participants aren't necessarily ready to jump on board and start sharing. If they can at least engage in the process and talk to us about the processes that they use, how they would tie in together, that will actually make the project more successful through that. So I'd sort of plea for engagement on that basis.
Thank you, and I would second that and second John's request too for 314B, if I may. So, but yeah, thank you very much to the entire panel for joining us today. Thank you to our audience for listening in. I really hope you found it useful and insightful. I definitely learned a lot from you all, so thank you for that, and thank you for all of the questions. Really engaging. So, yeah, with that, I'll pass it back to JP to continue on with the rest of the conference.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gemma, John, Kristen, Jonathan, and Mike for exploring the challenges behind data sharing and for all your time today and also in preparing for the discussion. So many thanks. So thank you for joining us and hopefully see you at the next session or later this week.